I'm the director of an insane asylum located in the woods of Western Canada. This area has a lower population now than it did 100 years ago. Likewise, I'm the only inmate at this asylum, of which I am the chief employee. A bookkeeping error has allowed me to keep getting paid for almost 30 years now. I'm not about to blow the whistle on this sweet deal. For the first decade or so, I kept the lights on and the doors open in case someone came by seeking treatment. No one ever came. The doors did on occasion blow open, and the cost of heating the place during the coldest months became prohibitive, so I shut most of it down. On the front door, there's a notice asking anyone seeking mental health treatment to call my phone number. My phone has not rung for over 20 years. I've come up with no good reason to call anyone, so for all I know, the phone is no longer in service. Maybe squirrels ate the wire. Maybe an ice storm took down the telephone lines. You may wonder how I sustain myself here in the middle of nowhere. I'm still eating the canned rations that I found on the day I first arrived. As far as I can tell, I would have to live to be 300 before I consumed all the canned beans, beets, tuna, peas, and soups. During the warm weather months, I eat vegetables from my garden, and apples, cherries, pears, and apricots from our orchard. The fruits are not doing well. Someday soon I expect the last fruit tree will die. They don't live forever, you know. I have saved seeds from those fruits and will start planting new trees next year, if I live that long. I'm almost 70. There appears to be nothing wrong with me, but I know from this point on, it's not unheard of for people to simply die. Sometimes there's a warning, other times not much. Years ago, one of my healthiest friends died from pancreatic cancer when he was in his prime. 3 weeks passed from diagnosis to death. Well, I've never been extraordinarily fit or healthy. Simply puttering about the grounds gives me a modicum of exercise. When I pass, no one will notice. If I have some warning, I think I'll try to go outside so my body can be consumed by animals, insects, and birds. I'd hate to leave a mess inside. Although it's hard to imagine now, I used to be quite a party animal. In graduate school, I was the clown who tried to get everyone drunk on a punch laced with pure alcohol. I'd steal the alcohol from the lab, and a liter was enough to bring a large group to its knees. I thought I needed a lot of friends, and they needed me. Now I realize that was simply a convenient fiction. It worked for that time in my life. I pursued graduate work even after I got my medical license to practice psychiatry. They paid for my tuition, why not? Hospital administration was the wave of the future, and I rode that wave here, to the woods of western British Columbia. I had a wife for a brief time back in Vancouver, but we parted ways before I was offered this position. In fact, I would have never applied for such a job if I'd been happily married. We have a car here at the Institute, and I used to drive it to the nearest city, an 80-mile round trip, back when my sex drive was more pronounced. There was an establishment on the edge of town, a sort of bar with rooms upstairs and women who would accommodate men in my position. After a while, my trips grew less frequent, and then they stopped altogether. Oh, sure, I had the money and could afford it, but the desire had waned. Likewise, I found there was less and less I desired to buy in stores. We had a Fred Meyer store that sprawled over several acres, but I couldn't find anything I wanted to buy. When I first realized that I would probably have no clients and nothing to do, I thought about raiding the pharmacy for drugs I could either ingest for my own entertainment or sell. But since they pay me well and I have no expenses, I keep accumulating money through the direct deposits of my paycheck into my bank account. Eventually, I diversified some of my holdings by buying stocks, bonds, and precious metals. But even that activity failed to hold my interest. Most of the drugs we give psychiatric patients are no fun at all and run little risk of being used for recreation. As I methodically went through our inventory, I tried to imagine myself enjoying them and could not form a concrete image that would induce me to do so. If I tried to sell them, I'd risk arrest for no meaningful gain. So I abandoned this pursuit and instead decided to put my energies into exploring the woods that surrounded our institute. At night, I can hear wolves howl. Most of the time they're far away, but sometimes alarmingly close. Last night I howled with them, sticking my head out the window and looking up at a full moon. The woods are pine and appear jet black at night, a mass of howling darkness that flows in every direction. I have a shortwave radio in the attic. In this day of the internet, it seems horribly outdated, but it still works. I can pick up signals from Russia and Asia quite easily. On a cold night, sometimes the radio waves skip across the globe like stones on a pond. Even though I no longer have a license to transmit, I do, using my call letters from 50 years ago. There's something exciting about going against the grain and resurrecting an old technology. Sure, I could simply email someone far away or post on a forum, but what's exciting about that? Deciphering words through the crackle of static caused by 1,000 thunderstorms over the Pacific seems a noble pursuit. It was doing this that I first came into contact with Olga. A medical doctor who no longer practiced, she lived alone in Siberia near Lake Baikal. Her English was quite good. After we talked for a few days, she confessed she didn't have an amateur radio license either. As crimes go, this seemed a small one. Because we were simply talking and there would be no trace of our conversation unless someone were making an audio recording, I opened up about my absurd situation here at the Institute. Being used to Soviet and now Russian bureaucracy, she wasn't surprised. It turns out that, unlike many of her friends and neighbors, she was not impoverished. Her late husband had done well in the oil and gas business. Like me, she was somewhat embarrassed by her riches. She didn't think about them much. It's only when you have no money that it becomes the central fact in your life. We talked every evening for over a month when she proposed that she come for a visit. She could fly into Vancouver and I'd pick her up at the airport. I had no idea what she looked like, nor did it matter. I told her my age, and so I imagined she had some idea of the old man she'd be visiting. Sex didn't promise to be an important part of the equation. She arrived the next week. I was pleasantly surprised to meet a trim woman in her 50s who seemed as relaxed and witty as she had over the radio. I guess I'd been fooling myself about the sex part because it became the glue that held us together. Once she arrived, we jumped straight into the sack and didn't come up for air for almost a week. Turns out she had a 3-month tourist visa, and we could easily extend that by a trip to the Russian consulate. So we were set. We were a couple. Everything had changed, yet we still had nothing to do. As anyone who's been single for a long time and then is suddenly coupled, being with someone else doesn't necessarily solve anything. And that's when Olga came up with a plan. We will start a group, a cult, a religious society based on high ideals. You will be our head, but you will not talk. I will do all the talking. We'll invite people from all over the world to come here and live together, working towards some lofty goal. Well, what goal? I have not gotten that far yet. But from what I know of human nature, if you offer people a way out, some will choose to take it. We can start with Russians, and then we can expand our scope. Well, it turned out to be just that simple. Within a month of her posting an invitation on several social media sites, we had 12 Russians who'd made the journey. Within another month, we had a Brazilian couple, a man from Vietnam, a woman from Malaysia, a family of 4 from South Africa. We capped enrollment at 20 to see how it would work out. She named the group Revolution from Within. Seemed a clumsy title to me, but since my role was to be a silent presence, I said nothing. During our meetings, I'd wear a long white wig. I looked like Johnny Winter. She'd talk about whatever interested her. We'd sing simple songs, dance a little. She was very interested in getting input from our members. Our activities involved working online, Fiverr, that sort of thing. Our members wrote articles, did artwork, recorded voiceovers, anything that someone needed to be done and was willing to pay for. At first, the money wasn't much, but then with higher approval ratings, they could raise their rates, and they did. Our first members were a bit lopsided gender-wise, as we had too many females, so we recruited a few more males of varying ages. We advanced cautiously. After 6 months, we'd lost a few members, but gained an equal number. Our crowd was a bit long in the tooth. Young people didn't find us sexy enough and took their communal instincts elsewhere. One of our older men was obviously mentally ill, but so long as he didn't bother anyone, we let him stay. He was aware of his condition and had been asked to leave other communities, so he kept a low profile. 2 middle-aged Danish women were obviously in a lesbian partnership, and all went well until one started to transfer her affections to another woman. The abandoned party did not take that well. She threatened violence and then threatened us all with going to the police and complaining that we were a sick sex cult. We let her make her complaint, but the police never came. So she left in a huff. We never grew above 30 members. Our weekly meetings became too tedious and complicated when the group got too large. I busied myself studying the history of the asylum, of which I was the chief operating officer. Turns out the man I replaced had been quite a colorful character, especially by Canadian standards. In addition to running the asylum, he was a Boy Scout leader, but ran a troop that adhered to fundamentalist Christian principles. They would walk on their knees through the woods and then rub their bleeding knees on a special rug, which they kept in a darkened room under the stairs. They worshipped the statues of the U.S. presidents at Mount Rushmore and made a pilgrimage once a year. He was the Canadian yodeling champion and built harpsichords in his spare time. His death was quite unusual. During a summer theater production of the Canadian Mountie-themed musical Little Mary Sunshine, in which he played the part of Mary, he burst into flame on stage. Spontaneous human combustion. They brought down the curtain and used fire extinguishers to quell the flames, but in the end, all that was left in the pile of ash was one femur. Olga was doing a good job with the congregation, though a faction developed that wanted to codify our beliefs. What was our creed? On what could we agree? Since we had no sacred text, it was up to us to create something that would unify us and focus our efforts. At first, I tried using an application I found on the internet, which created nonsense phrases that sounded like New Age wisdom. It's not about synchronicity as much as it is about diversity of viewpoints. People cherish that which promises entanglement, but delivers freedom and obligation in equal measure. Death is merely a mode of objective silence in the face of random noise. We tried using those to inspire a meeting, but they fell flat very quickly. Instead, we found simply taking familiar concepts from the writings of Dale Carnegie, Norman Vincent Peale, and then rephrasing them in modern language after adding a dash of obfuscation did a much better job of focusing our meetings and inspiring our group. By the way, we never called ourselves a congregation. That sounded too religious. We were a group. That sounded therapeutic. I suppose we were one of those watered-down religions that believe we're all gods and no one has any more direct path to the divine than any other. People should be kind to each other, and there's no such thing as sin, much less a demand for its forgiveness. On this, we could agree so readily we never had to spell it out. We weren't running a summer camp, and we felt compelled to create an atmosphere of spiritual growth. We had no demonstrations of faith healing nor obvious miracles with which to impress our clients. They were, of course, free to delude themselves in any way they saw fit. But then one day, while walking in the woods, I noticed a profusion of mushrooms growing out of dung. I wasn't sure, but they sure looked like psilocybin to me. I brought a handful home and photographed them, then asked the crowd wisdom of the internet to identify them. All votes came back as psilocybin. There were hundreds of them back where I had seen them, and I imagined thousands more nearby. So I took a group with me and we combed the area. We ended up with bushel baskets full after only an hour or so. Someone had recently published a book that chronicled legitimate research into hallucinogens and was quite pumped about the idea of using them in our next ceremony. And someone else purchased a copy of the book online. By the end of the day, half of us had read it. We were all quite enthused, and on the morning of our weekly meeting, we decided on a ceremony. It was summer. Many of us thought we'd spend the day naked. We had all gotten used to it, thought nothing of it, though the ones who were naked were careful not to venture too close to the road. At about 9 in the morning, we formed a circle and chanted advertising slogans from 50 years ago. You look smart when you shave Gillette. It's the finest shave a man can get. Brill cream. A little dab'll do ya. Use more, only if you dare. Watch out, the gals will all pursue ya. They'll love to get their fingers in your hair. And the tongue twister of them all. Crest has been shown to be an effective decay preventive dentifrice when used in a prescribed program of oral hygiene and regular professional care. Chanting these in solemn tones always made us laugh. Then we ate a few mushrooms. From what we'd read, dosage wasn't critical. A typical trip would last 4 hours. If anyone did become psychotic, well, we certainly had all the antipsychotic medicines on hand that anyone could hope for. But I wasn't worried that that would be the case. Within half an hour, we began to feel the effects. Colors became brighter. A general feeling of euphoria ensued. We found everything in our ken amusing and were delighted by it. Natural things seemed profound compared to man-made items, which seemed silly and sometimes ugly. Yeah, it was a good day to be naked outdoors. One woman laughed so loudly and long I began to worry about her, but then she settled down and simply lay on her back in the grass and stared up at the tree branches. She stayed that way for a couple of hours. I reasoned this was an indisputably good thing we had discovered and would incorporate it into our regular practice. By now, I'd stopped wearing my Johnny Winter wig and pretending not to be able to talk. I was no longer anyone special around here, which was fine with me. Olga was the boss, and she was good at it. When cold weather arrived, the idea of wandering around outside tripping seemed less attractive, so we cut back on our weekly mushroom use until we could construct a sweat lodge that might seem less artificial and forbidding than the rooms of the Institute. Once a mental hospital, always a mental hospital. Klaus, a German who had experience building structures, designed and supervised the building of this sweat lodge. It was a dome about 10 feet tall at its apex, about 30 feet in diameter. It could hold all of us. We heated rocks in a pit nearby and brought the hot rocks into the dome so there wouldn't be a problem with smoke. A hole at the top of the dome that could be enlarged or reduced depending on how hot we wanted it and how many people were inside. Once the walls were dried, we set about painting them. Everyone took a turn, some filling more space than others. I remember thinking, this is a real high point in our time together. And then that thought made me realize this too would pass. Revolution from within would only last a finite number of months or years. We would all move on someday. When the Royal Canadian Mounted Police paid us a visit, they asked a lot of questions about who was in charge and who owned this facility. It was easy enough to prove that it was a government hospital and I was its director. They were more interested in what we had become recently. I guess somebody had seen somebody naked from the road. Was fraud involved? Since no money transactions were obviously part of the mix, they were puzzled more than suspicious. Olga assured me we had nothing to fear. They didn't want to put us in jail. We had no enemies to speak of, at least not compared to back in Russia, where everyone was either an oligarch or a apparatchik. When I was summoned to Vancouver to a meeting with my superiors, I was strangely glad to have my secret out. Olga had given me some good advice just before I left. Offer to buy the place, she suggested. And that proved to be the trump card in my deck. After considerable lament over how much the Institute was costing the state, my offer to buy the facility silenced all criticism. We were prepared to pay full market value. Even though I was simply giving them back most of the money they'd given me over the years, it seemed like a fair deal all around. Market value wasn't much for an old hospital in the woods far from any city. By the time warm weather returned, I was now the owner of 40 acres of woods and a 1920s-era insane asylum. New mushrooms popped up all around, and we were very, very happy.